This lecture is our third lecture in the Civil Rights series. This will focus on student activism, picking up from the Little Rock Nine and taking on the national movements of the 1960s up to 1968. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was founded in 1960. It was a youth wing of SCLC, but it became independent. If you remember from the previous lecture, SCLC is Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization, this Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was SNCC was the most ambitious and the most active of the grassroots organizations. Led by black students, included northern white sympathizers, people of different classes, races, and from various geographical backgrounds, all who got involved in various civil rights movements and protests. One of the most famous and one of the first led by SNCC was the sit-ins. So this is Greensboro, North Carolina, 1960, where you have your first sit-in at a Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. They were led by college students, not Martin Luther King Jr. You don't understand the power that students had during the civil rights movement. When it came to the sit-ins, where they sat at the lunch counters, refused to leave until they were served or until the lunch counter closed for the day, they decided to start this massive movement. And as you can see by this picture, every seat is taken. Not because every person was served there, but rather because they were decided that they were going to sit there and wait until being served. So they had some tactics. Dress in your Sunday best. Make sure that you look your best when you're going to possibly be photographed or arrested. Be respectful to employees and police. You don't cuss at them. You don't do any of that. You ask very politely for a milkshake, and then you say, "I'm sorry, sir, I cannot leave until you serve me." Do not resist arrest. Do not fight back. And remember, journalists are everywhere. If you need to go to class, there was someone to take your place so that you could attend your classes. And the idea is that you wanted to make sure that journalists had pictures like this. Everyone dressed nicely, studying, sitting, waiting. But you also want to remember journalists are everywhere in case they caught pictures like these. As you can see here, you have a group of students in a sit-in, and they're being very patient, and they're being abused by the students around them. This is a very infamous picture of the sit-ins, sort of this effort to show that you want to make sure that you look the best in these pictures and that you don't look like you're the hostile aggressor. And this was really the tenets of Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachings, but then also groups like SNCC and CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, making sure that it was this passive resistance. You're not fighting, you're just resisting. Eventually, some of the fountains will close until in the interest of public safety, and eventually, because of things like the Civil Rights Act, they'll have to reopen and serve all. Not only were there sit-ins, but there were swim-ins at beaches and pools, kneel-ins at churches, drive-ins at motels, and study-ins at universities. The Civil Rights Movement was to integrate all levels of accommodations, not just the buses, not just schools. SNCC will then take their movement on the road. They're going to organize the Freedom Rides. This is where college students will ride to integrate interstate bus lines and terminals. Remember, these cross state lines, so that brings it to federal attention. On May 14th, 1961, in Anniston, Alabama, one of the buses was torched. And so JFK, who had run on a civil rights platform but hadn't wanted to act yet on civil rights, felt that he had to send in troops to protect the riders. Here's a picture of the bus being torched. Mobs also attacked them at bus stations. There's a very famous story about a white passenger, or white college student, who was traveling with the men, and they arrived at a bus terminal, and there was a mob, who was waiting with clubs and chains ready to beat the passengers as they got off the buses. And he decided that he was going to get off first in the hopes that it would allow his black friends to get away safely. And so he threw himself into the mob, where he was beaten almost to death. He ended up in a coma, but his friends were able to get away safely. And so the federal government is forced to provide troops to allow the Freedom Rides to ride with protection. Students will also make an effort to try to integrate schools. James Meredith, a Air Force veteran, was a civil rights advocate, and he was determined to integrate the most segregated school in the most segregated state in the South. And so he wanted to go to Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi. It took 400 federal marshals and 3,000 troops to enroll Meredith in his first class, American colonial history. By the time he graduated, it cost $4 million taxpayer dollars, scores of injuries, and the lives of 2 men. Remember, with University of Mississippi, it's a state school, which means it receives federal funding, especially for their ROTC program. Thus, you cannot deny a person the use of their GI Bill simply because of their race. James Meredith will test it, and he will integrate the University of Mississippi. In 1963, we move our focus to Birmingham, or the nickname it received, Bombingham. It was the most segregated city in America. Half of the city's population was black, but less than 15% of voters were. They had more than 50 cross burnings and 18 bomb attacks in 6 years. So students, high school and middle school and even elementary school students, decided that they were going to march for integration. And as you can see, I have here, they had small children with them. And so the police responded by using fire hose and police attack dogs against unarmed, nonviolent protest marchers. These high-pressure water hoses were strong enough to knock loose bricks from buildings or strip bark from trees at the distance of 100 feet. These actions were broadcast on national television. It will then be followed by a church bombing where 4 girls were killed. They had been practicing the song that heals. The peace that heals. So if you look at some of these images, here's a sit-in, and then you have some of the marchers. This is a picture of John L. Lewis. But more famously are, of course, this one down here at the bottom, which shows you on the bottom left-hand side, that shows you students being plastered up against the building with the fire hoses turned on them. You also see in the upper right-hand corner Bull Connor pulling a young man into an attack dog, or possibly trying to move him away from an attack dog. Either way, the picture tells a story. Here's another image of the fire hoses. You can see how close those firemen are to the protesters when they're turning those fire hoses on them. Here you have a young boy who's dealing with the problems of tear gas, which was turned on the protesters. Another image of protesters trying to protect their heads, trying not to resist, but yet protect themselves. White America saw 500 kids get arrested and attacked with dogs. There was now much support for civil rights legislation, and so JFK felt that he had to submit a civil rights bill to Congress. In order to gain support for the civil rights bill, you have the March on Washington. 250,000 to 300,000 blacks and whites together. This, of course, is where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. The march was a major in leading to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 took federal action against segregation in public accommodations, public facilities, and employment. But there was still a problem with voting. There's still problems with poll taxes, literacy tests, but most importantly, intimidation. And so with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Martin Luther King Jr., SCLC, and SNCC will next focus on getting the vote, getting the ballot. So here's a picture from the March on Washington. In order to try to get the ballot, they also had to get people registered to vote, and that was the focus of Freedom Summer. Mississippi had the largest black minority, but only 5% of eligible registered voters. That's because Mississippi had a law stating that names of prospective voters had to be published for 2 weeks in local newspapers. This allowed the local KKK to get your name and address and be able to start an effort to intimidate you to remove your registration. And so to get African Americans registered to vote, college students from the North traveled to the South, both white and black students together. 3 students disappeared that summer, 2 white, 1 black, and one of the white students was Jewish. The KKK killed them. Here's the missing poster for these 3 students. At this point, there is attention brought to this national movement to get the right to vote. And so Martin Luther King Jr., as well as SCLC, decided that they were going to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The march climaxed at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is where Bloody Sunday took place. Heavily armed state troopers attacked the marchers using tear gas, whips, and clubs. This was televised, leading to outrage. On March 15th, Johnson called for strong federal voting rights law, and thus we end up with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It gets rid of literacy tests and requires federal observation of the ballot. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Give us the ballot and the South will never be the same again." In 1964, we also have the 24th Amendment passed, which abolishes poll taxes. Now we have federal oversight into voting. We have gotten rid of poll taxes, which means it doesn't matter if you know how to read or write. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It doesn't matter if you're black or white. You have access to the polls. Here are some of the famous images from the march from Selma to Montgomery. And of course, here you can see some of the troopers approaching the protesters. 1968 is a pivotal year in the civil rights movement. April 4th, 1968, you have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. This is going to lead to race riots throughout the United States. But it also signals a shift in civil rights, more minority group involvement, and also increased focus on black power. That will be our next lecture, focusing on black power and sort of a response to 1968.